So let's go over the anatomy of a California legislative constitutional amendment. In the California legislature, the members of the Assembly and Senate can actually place a constitutional amendment before the statewide electorate for their consideration. The Office of Legislative Counsel defines a constitutional amendment as a resolution proposing a change to the California Constitution. It may be presented by the legislature or by initiative and is adopted upon voter approval at a statewide election. So, in order for the legislature to place a constitutional amendment on the ballot, it requires a 2/3 vote of each house, but no action by the governor. So, what are the component parts of a constitutional amendment? Well, in terms of its anatomy, a constitutional amendment proposed by the legislature contains the following main provisions. At the top of the bill for an ACA appears the language California Legislature dash what is the 2-year regular session. And the only two items that change here would be the 2-year legislative session, or if it's introduced in an extraordinary session, then it would be so noted. That is not included on a Senate constitutional amendment. Next is the Senate or Assembly constitutional amendment number, which is to the right of the Assembly constitutional amendment designation or Senate constitutional amendment designation. And as you probably know, the Assembly chief clerk and the Senate secretary are the ones who assign those constitutional amendments their numbers for each and every constitutional amendment that is introduced in its respective house of origin. And it's done so based upon the order in which it was introduced at the Assembly or Senate desk. And of course, the number of the ACA or SCA remains the same throughout the legislative process, even when the measure is considered in the second house. Then next is the author or authors, as well as principal co-authors and then co-authors. Keep in mind that in the US Congress and many state legislatures, the author of a legislative measure is known as the sponsor. But in the California legislature, the author is the legislator who actually authors the legislative measure, such as a constitutional amendment. And then after them, the first line after that is the principal co-author or co-authors, and then the next line is co-authors of the measure. Next is the date that it was introduced, and date amended is up on the very top of the bill if there are amendments. Next comes the constitutional amendment title, which is a short phrase, and it always begins a resolution to propose to the people of the state of California an amendment to the Constitution of the state by amending blank, whatever you're going to amend, relating to blank, whatever the subject matter is. Then there's a brief legislative council digest, which begins with the constitutional amendment number, the phrase as introduced or as amended, the lead author, and a short phrase regarding the subject matter of the proposed constitutional amendment. And thereafter, the Legislative Council Digest contains a statement of existing constitutional provisions, followed by a brief explanation of what the proposed constitutional amendment is actually proposing to do. Then you have the digest keys, the vote, which is always 2/3. It doesn't make an appropriation, but it could go to the fiscal committee. It could create a state mandated local program. Thereafter, you have the amendment of the proposed constitutional amendment or addition. And of course, you could add, amend, or repeal sections of the Constitution, similar to bills. Also similar to bills, they're divided, the constitutional amendments, that is, are actually divided into sections. Now, before the actual constitutional amendment text begins, you'll see the phrase resolved by the Senate, if it's an SCA, the Assembly concurring that the legislature of the state of California at its, whatever the 2-year regular session is, commencing on the blank day of December of that year, 2/3 of the membership of each house concurring, hereby proposes to the people of the state of California that the Constitution of the state be amended as follows. And then there is the language set forth, and those are the main provisions that make up the anatomy of a proposed constitutional amendment in the California state legislature.